There is a very, very, very long episode of Strange Playgrounds coming sometime this week, in which I discuss with Rowan B. Fortune lots and lots of subjects, ranging from my short story collection, Born in Blood, to the nature of mythology, to video games, literature, film, cinema. It's a standard Strange Playgrounds kind of conversation, where we veer all over the place and go into many and varied different subjects. I mean, but one thing that really snared and is sort of caught in my craw from that conversation is that notion of mythology, because it is, as anyone who's even watched my Let's Plays will know, mythology is my thing. It's what enthuses me, it's what invigorates me, it's what inspires me. I have a great deal of time for writers and creators, artists who can not only cultivate mythology but can imply it. That's something that a lot of video games do these days. It never used to, and they used to do it a lot in the 16-bit era when there wasn't really time for exposition or for sort of cultivating a more detailed mythology or communicating it for that matter. So they had to rely on visuals, environments, symbolism and whatnot. And I love that form of mythology. I absolutely love it, because it places the onus on the audience, upon the reader, the player, the consumer, if you like. It allows them to engage with the material in a way that they can't when the mythology is more established and imposed. And don't get me wrong, there is a lot of space and time, and I absolutely love it when writers and creators take a great deal of time to cultivate a back mythology for their work, and it is so detailed and so beautiful and so well put together. It depends on the work in question. It's not an either-or question. You can have both, and it depends on the work in question. I mean, a really good example for me recently was Susanna Collins, who wrote Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell. Now, that is a book whose mythology is explicitly detailed and communicated to the point whereby the book is enormous, because it's just full of backstory. It's full of details on how the back mythology of the current narrative works. What Susanna Collins has done is mythologized history. She's taken British history and introduced mythology into it as though it is history. So it essentially just takes established British history and marries into it mythology as though it is fact. So there are just fairies and wizards and fae things. They are part and parcel of history in that mythology. And it's beautiful. It's really well detailed. She's taken so much time to determine how this impacts upon culture and politics and the standard meta-narratives and preconceptions of that world. But it's a kind of mythology that I have to be in the right mood for, because it is one that is absolute and is sort of objective. There's not much wiggle room for interpretation in it as to what is happening and why. It is just established, and the author gives it to you as part of their storytelling, and it's wonderful. It works really well. But for me, I much prefer the slightly more Philip Pullman-esque, Clive Barkerian way of telling mythology, where there are details but they're suggestive. So you get a sense of what the mythology is, but it's broad and it's vast, and it can be interpreted in any number of ways, and that kind of it obliges the reader or the audience to engage with the subject matter and to bring their own material to it. So if it's done well, you never get any two audience members who have the same interpretation, because they are bringing their own interpretations, their own filters, their own biases and preconceptions to that interpretation. And that's wonderful. For me, that is something I try to do in my own fiction, because that's how I like my mythology. I think it's a very clever thing to do. It's a very narrow tightrope to walk. It's very difficult to do effectively. what you have to do is imply. You provide certain details that suggest what might be going on, and then the reader or the audience can take them, put them together in their own minds, and determine potential interpretations. It's a very sophisticated way of storytelling insofar as I'm concerned, and much more engaging than just having the monolithic, well, this is the mythology, this is what is happening, as the author dictates, and again, don't get me wrong, I have a lot of time for that kind of mythology too. I actually really, really enjoy it, because I enjoy real-world mythology. I enjoy things like Greek mythology. Ancient Greek mythology has been one of my favourite things since I was a boy, since I was before school, when I used to go to the library with my mum, and we used to each get a big pile of books. In my big pile, there would always be a book about ancient Greek mythology, ancient Egyptian mythology, Hindu mythology, and so on and so forth. And those mythologies are absolute. They are pretty much almost biblical in the way they tell their stories. This happens, this happens, this happens, and this happens, and these characters do this because of that. The gods are this, the titans are that, and so on and so forth. It's fairly absolute and overt, but I love it. I love that stuff. I think it's really, really beautiful. I prefer, in terms of both the way I tell story and in terms of the way I consume story these days, I much prefer the more postmodern form of mythology making and communication, which you find in things like Dark Souls, Bloodborne, in things like House of Leaves. House of Leaves is probably the archetype for this, where backstory and mythology are implied through suggestion and through scattered, almost incongruous details that you need to gather together, and then you can take time to interpret and to piece together into your own almost bespoke mythology. It's a very clever thing for a writer or creator to do, and it's very, very, very difficult. It's something I did with the Born in Blood series. I mean, I do it with all my writing. Almost all of my short stories have a back mythology which is not specific. It is something that, because I tend to write from the perspectives of characters as well, so they are immersed in it, and they're often characters who are not initiated. They're characters who are drawn into the mythology through one thing or another, so they're not initiated themselves. It's esoteric to them. They don't know what is happening, so they have to interpret what's happening based on their preconceptions and so on and so forth, in the same way that the reader then has to as well. There's very rarely like a hand of God or a voice of God coming through and telling you what is happening. The characters discern what is happening through their experiences, and that's something I try to do with Born in Blood, with the mythology of Aberrice. Now, the funny thing about Aberrice is that in my own mind, it's fairly specific in the sense that it derives from very particular things. So as detailed in the short story collections, Aberrice is essentially the manifestation of all of our traumas. It is human trauma as mythology, on the basis that the experiences that are truly universal, that unite us as a species, are traumatic by their very nature. By their very nature, even when they're wonderful, they're often traumatic in the sense that they break us down, and they break us down to a degree that we can recreate ourselves. Like falling in love, for example. Falling in love is a trauma after a sense, in that it changes us, it transforms us, often violently. It takes us and it rips us up from our preconceptions and our established contexts and shows us new parameters. So falling in love would be part of Aberrice. In Born in Blood, there is this notion that there is a metaphysics. There is a metaphysics in reality. And what happens is states and conditions, which are kind of like afterlives, I suppose, but they exist concurrently with the living, waking world, coalesce around particular human experiences, ideas, ideologies. So there are these vast wastelands beyond the waking world where failed or forgotten ideologies or concepts or notions have accrued as city-states or as countries or as nations, and most of them have failed. The vast majority of them have failed, so there is like a broken down, ruinous remains of what was once utopianism, yeah? Aberrice is the first and last of them, Aberice is the one that's formed from our collective trauma, and which therefore emphasizes that trauma as something holy and wonderful and beautiful. It is, from a superficial analysis, it could be regarded as a manifestation of what we would consider hell, in that it consists of suffering and of torment and mutilation. But those who experience Aberice, or who have some notion of it, often are beatific about it rather than horrified or disgusted or repulsed. And that's because in Aberice, through trauma, we come to know ourselves. We come to know those parts of ourselves that we sublimate and that we are taught to deny throughout our lives, throughout our waking lives. And through that, we come to transcend them. So through Aberice, you can become something beautiful. You can actually transcend your humanity, the sort of brute parameters into which you are born. And that is kind of what I was getting at with Aberice. In book 1, Aberice is established and how it interacts with the waking world. I mean, it's not specific. You have to sort of piece it together based on what the short stories tell you and what the characters go through. And then in Born in Blood Volume 2, that mythology ends. There is an ending to Aberice, which of course only ends with an end to humanity in all of its many states and conditions. But within it, you have all of our enshrinements of our own suffering. So in the very last story, which is called The Last Gospel, in Born in Blood Book 2, you have a character who is kind of the epitome and the apotheosis of all our suffering messiahs, all of our sacrificial lambs, if you like. So he is Christ, and he is Woden on the World Ash, and he is all of these characters who emphasize suffering as a means of transcendence. He is the last living soul in Aberice. After all others have failed, after everything has fallen and stopped, he is the last living soul, the last collection of stories to be told, as all realities are winking out around him. And Aberice is the very last one to go. It's the very, very, very last condition to collapse in on itself. There is a kind of nihilism to that metaphysics. That's for damn sure, and that was something I really wanted to emphasize, because what it coalesced around is this. It's almost an anti-natalist notion, I suppose. I don't take that the wrong way. I'm not an out-and-out anti-natalist. But there are elements of the ideology of antinatalism that intrigue me. There are ideas that I find interesting, and certain foundational assertions that I find to be very difficult to argue against. One of them being, of course, the notion that we are, all of us, victims. Every born creature on this planet, and any that has ever been born in history, is a victim, because birth by its very nature, conception by its very nature, is an imposition. We don't get any say in it. We don't get any say in it at all. It is the first trauma, and it's the one that resonates down our days, our every waking moment, our every thought or feeling, conscious or unconscious, our every fantasy, dread, everything. It informs so much of what we are and how we function, and it unites us all. We all experience it, regardless of circumstances of birth, time period, culture, creed, and barring some incredible advancement in sort of transhumanist technology, we all always will be united by that suffering, by that trauma. It's something that we don't get any say in, and it's the first thing we experience. Birth is probably one of the most traumatic things any human being could possibly ever suffer. It's so traumatic, our minds cut it off. It doesn't allow us to remember it. And those who claim to remember it consciously are lying. But we do remember it subconsciously. The trauma is still there. It still echoes throughout our days. I mean, what's the first thing we do when we're born? Where the first breath we take is one of indignity. It's choked. We are filthy and in pain and stinking and trying to choke our first breaths, in this traumatic world that we've been forced into, this world of light and noise and pain. That is what Aberice is kind of getting at. That's what I really wanted to explore in this collection of short stories. And initially it was going to be nihilistic. It was going to be really dark, because it is about trauma. But at the same time, as I was discussing with Rowan last night, I find it very, very difficult to maintain that, because in the essential heart of me, in my soul, I am a utopian. There is this spark of hope. I do believe in the power of human imagination and of our ability to transcend ourselves, even at our worst. Even in our doldrums, I do believe we have that capacity, and that does come through too. So even at the end of everything, there is this notion that there is potential. There is potential for more to go on after, or for our suffering to transform, and for it to transform us and to make us more, to make us better. Even the darkest experiences, even the most hideous things in human imagination and experience can make us better, or can become stepping stones to broader contexts, to unimagined states of being and operation. And that is again what comes through certainly in the last story, the last gospel, and in most of the stories in Born in Blood Volume 2. I think Volume 2 is maybe a little bit more utopian than the ones that have gone before, than Born in Blood Volume 1. Born in Blood Volume 1 is kind of establishing, so it establishes the darkness, if you like. It establishes the where we're going to go with these short stories, where there is the death of hope, there is the destruction of all of our ideals. I mean, one of the stories is called Celesticide, and Celesticide is essentially, it is literally people murdering angels, and it's the revelation that even when angels descend from on high in a sort of biblical sense, they aren't what they appear to be. And even when they are terribly pure and wonderful, that is awful. That is an horrific and terrible thing. I think the last line in that is something along the lines of, "We smile knowing that heaven too can die," or something like that. There is a real kind of deconstructionist thing going on here in this mythology. And it's kind of how I like to communicate mythology, even in my longer stories, which do tend to have a bit more in the way of mythological depth to them. I don't like mythology to become monolithic. I like it to be, even when it seems to be establishing rules, I'll then break it. I'll turn it on its head, or introduce a way in which it transforms itself, or isn't going to turn out how you would expect it to turn out, given the archetypes that you've been provided with before, or the templates of mythology that are assumed or enshrined in culture or in literature or in this kind of fiction or in that kind of fiction. I like to turn things on their heads a little bit. Whether I succeed or not, that's kind of up to you. It's kind of up to the reader. For some people it will, for some people it won't. I am keenly aware that the way these stories work is there's a kind of hypnotic element to them. You kind of need to let yourself go a little bit. It sounds really pretentious and awful, but there is a way of reading them. There is a way of reading them. And I found that, certainly with Volume 1, the people who can do that, who give themselves up, who just go with the flow of them, they really enjoy it. It really does carry them to some strange and wonderful places. It's kind of like a strange hypnosis happens. That's some of the feedback I've got, that people feel like they're being hypnotized by it, which I really like. That is definitely something I want to go for. That is something I really, really want to go for with these short story collections. There is a queer element. Oh wow! I mean, I can't write anything that is not queer. I mean, it's not just sort of like. It's trans in a way that you could not even imagine. It's not just related to identity or sex or anatomy or anything like that. It is human beings transcending themselves and their species and their assumptions of who and what they are, becoming other. And sometimes that's wonderful and sometimes that's terrible. Very often it seems wonderful and then it's ripped away from them by something awful. There's one story I'm very pleased with called One Man's Sickness. And in One Man's Sickness, what happens is that you're already in the midst of a kind of breakdown and apocalypse that is happening as you're dropped into the story, and that you follow a group of characters who are kind of trying to escape it, and they discover that it's not something they should even want to escape. It inflicts transformations that may seem initially horrific, but which are inevitable and which are actually can be kind of wonderful because they reflect who you are. They reflect something essential within you. And this particular group find a little spit of utopia in the midst of chaos when they learn to embrace it. However, there is one man amongst them who is awful. He's a terrible man. He's a misogynist. He's a monster. And he's trying to put that aside. He's trying to be a better man, but he can't get away from it. It's still there in the back of his mind. And when the transformations come for him, it poisons everything. It poisons not only him, but the surrounding metaphysics. It's called one man's sickness, because out of the notion that all it takes is that. All it takes to poison a utopian vision is one man's sickness, and that's it. There is a kind of nihilism inherent to that, I suppose, because we are, as the short story collection really does emphasize, we are all created sick, and there's very little we can do about it. It's been a fascinating road. It's been a really fascinating road, and often very, very disturbing, very difficult to do. Like a lot of in order to write these short stories, again, it sounds really authory and pretentious, but I went to places with them. I tried to dig deep into my own traumas, and I've got a fairly traumatic background, not in comparison to some people. I mean, like my childhood was fine. I mean, all of my traumas are more sort of psychological than like externally imposed, but still quite profound. So I dig deep into my anxieties and my depressions and like my suicidal tendencies in order to write these stories. And there were periods when I had to back away from them because it was bubbling up again because of these stories. It was bubbling up underneath, because I was drawing on them in order to inform the stories. It's another thing I want. I want them to be sincere. I really want them to be sincere. In one of the stories, and it really did go back to my own high school life, which was probably one of the darkest periods of my life thus far. I was so depressed at that point and so out of love with the world. And there are two characters who are sort of late high school in the UK, so that they're like 18 years old. They're just on the cusp of a kind of adulthood, and they just basically say fuck it. They've had enough. They just say fuck it. We're going. We're leaving this, not only this school but this fucking world. We don't want it. They reject their parents' world, and through that rejection, they sort of open a hole through into their own dissonant, fractured fantasy world, which is itself problematic, but that's where they end up, and they experience transformations and transgressions as a result of that. And there's a lot of sexuality in these stories. There's a lot of, and I like that too. Sex in stories is something that I find peculiarly sacred. In every aspect, whether it's titillating and it's erotic, that is part of it, So yeah, there is a lot of sex, and a lot of transgressive sex in these stories as well. A lot of it is intermingled with a kind of violence, I suppose, but it's a transformative violence. It's a metaphysical violence. There's a lot of queer sex here. There's a lot of sex that transcends what sex means, which is very deliberate, very, very deliberate indeed. All of that is kind of here. It's what I was trying to do with these short stories, to capture something that is at the same time sacred and desecratory, which is profane and sacred at the same time, and which confuses those notions. It takes what people would consider to be infernal and profane and base, and then it rewrites it. It makes it the subject of the most legitimately sacred, and that's something I really love. That transgression I love, I absolutely adore, because I think legitimately and sincerely there is something sacred about those experiences, about our pain, about our trauma, about the experiences that take us to the very heights and the very depths. So things like sex, things like pain, things like love, things like loss, things like trauma and depression, I do feel that there is sanctity there, because they often teach us what we are. I know that for me, for my own depressive periods, which were profound and long and really dark, I mean like unfathomably dark, I came out of them a different person. I reached a kind of bedrock. I touched a kind of really bleak, black, abyssal bedrock of self. And from that I faced myself in that abyss and learned how to be more than that. You kind of learn the depths at which you can operate. And that teaches you so much about what you are and who you are and what you can cope with. And that's kind of what these stories are about in many respects. It's kind of what they're about. Content warnings to the nth degree for these short stories, to the nth degree. Everything. Childhood trauma, abuse, physical, emotional, despair, suicide, all of it is here. And a lot of it is very, very overt. If you are triggered or offended or find things like that difficult, these short story collections are going to be difficult for you. There's no doubt. But they're designed to be. I don't just want the reader to read about trauma. I want them to feel it. That for me is a point in what I create. It's a point in fiction. I want a kind of sincerity to it. So I want people to experience what the characters are experiencing. Otherwise, it's pointless. And that kind of feeds into the style of the writing, which is it's slightly stream of consciousness. It's slightly poetic rather than just standard prose, which some people will like, some people won't. It was true of Born in Blood Volume 1. Some people loved the abstraction of it, some people didn't. It depends on what your tastes are. But I really enjoyed writing them. It's been a blast writing them. It's been a revelation. It really has, ironically, given what I was trying to do with them. It's been a total revelation. It's been traumatic in and of itself in many ways, many ways, but it's also been a really fun, beautiful time, and has been a massive learning curve. I mean, I've learned a lot from writing these stories, and of what works, of what functions, of the kind of writer I am, kind of person I am, I suppose. And I sincerely hope you guys get something out of them too. Thanks so much, and Born in Blood Volume 2 up for pre-order now, links below, and also there's a bundle pack of Born in Blood Volumes 1 and 2 for a discount price. So once again, links below. I would highly recommend reading 1 first, because there are references in Volume 2 you may not understand otherwise. Until next time, my loves, bye-bye!